because he believed no storm could beat his fences or his luck, until thunder cracked so close. The porch boards shook and a blinding flash of lightning revealed what he feared most. The far gate torn loose, hanging open, cattle already shifting nervously toward the rising river. Caleb swore under his breath and ran for the barn, rain soaking him to the bone, saddle slapping against his leg as he mounted his horse and charged into the chaos, shouting commands that were ripped away by the wind, his mind racing through calculations of loss and damage, when suddenly he saw a figure ahead, small, soaked, bent against the storm, waving a lantern like a beacon of defiance. And for a wild moment he thought exhaustion had finally broken him, because no one in their right mind would be out there. Not alone, not in a storm that could kill a man where he stood. Yet the figure didn't vanish, and as Caleb rode closer, heart pounding harder than the thunder, he saw it was a woman, young but worn by hardship, her coat threadbare, her boots sinking into mud, hair plastered to her face as she yelled, not in fear, but in command, driving the cattle away from the river with nothing but her voice, the lantern, and sheer will. And it made no sense, none at all, because even seasoned ranch hands struggled in storms like this. Yet the cattle listened to her, turning, clustering, following as if they trusted her more than the fences that had failed. Caleb dismounted and shouted for her to get back, that she'd be killed, but she barely glanced at him, eyes sharp and focused, telling him the East Ridge was higher ground and the wind would push the herd that way if they worked together. And something in her certainty, quiet, unshaking, cut through his disbelief, forcing him to act instead of argue. And for the next endless hour they fought the storm side. The storm came down from the mountains without warning, rolling over the valley like a living thing, black clouds swallowing the afternoon sun and turning the wide-open land into a trembling, breathless silence. And Caleb Rowan, the richest rancher for 100 miles, stood on the porch of his massive ranch house with a knot in his chest he hadn't felt in years, because out there, beyond the fence lines and cottonwood trees, were nearly 600 head of cattle scattered across the lower pasture, and if the river broke its banks or the lightning stampeded them into the ravine, he would lose more than money. He would lose the last living legacy of his father, the man who taught him that cattle weren't just livestock. They were responsibility, pride, and survival. Caleb was known in town as a hard man, wealthy, distant, widowed young, never smiling longer than a second, and the hired hands respected him but never felt close enough to joke. Yet as the wind screamed and rain began to fall in heavy, icy sheets, none of them were anywhere near the ranch, having already driven into town to wait out the storm at Caleb's own command. By side, mud sucking at their boots, rain blinding them, lightning splitting the sky as cattle thundered past, and Caleb felt something strange awaken in him, a feeling he thought had died with his wife years ago, trust in another human being. When the worst of the storm finally broke and the rain softened to a steady fall, the herd stood safe on the ridge, alive, intact, breathing clouds into the cold air, and Caleb realized his hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the narrow escape, while the woman leaned on her knees, chest heaving, lantern guttering low, her face pale but determined, as if saving his cattle was simply the next task in a life that had never given her the luxury of fear. He offered her his coat and she hesitated, pride flickering in her eyes before exhaustion won, and as she slipped it on he noticed how thin she was, how the storm had nearly swallowed her whole, and yet she had stood against it anyway. And when he finally asked her name, she said it quietly like it didn't matter, like she expected nothing in return, and that unsettled him more than the storm ever could. Because people always wanted something from Caleb Rowan, money, favors, forgiveness. But this woman had saved his entire herd and asked for nothing. And as they walked back toward the ranch house under a clearing sky, the first stars breaking through the torn clouds, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the storm hadn't just spared his cattle. It had delivered something impossible onto his land, something that felt less like chance and more like a miracle he didn't yet understand. And if this story already has your heart racing and your emotions pulling in opposite directions, remember to subscribe to the channel, because this is only the beginning of a journey where fate, sacrifice, and unexpected love collide in ways that will stay with you long after the final word, morning, rose over the ranch like a promise kept, sunlight spilling across wet grass and quiet cattle as if the storm had never dared to touch them. Yet inside Caleb Rowan nothing felt settled. because the woman who had stood against thunder and flood now sat at his long kitchen table, wrapped in one of his blankets, hands curled around a mug of coffee she sipped like it might disappear. And the strange thing was how small she looked in daylight, compared to the force she had been in the storm. Her face marked by tired lines that spoke of long roads and longer nights, eyes steady but cautious, as if she expected kindness to come with conditions. Caleb had slept little, haunted by the image of her lantern swinging through the rain, by the impossible way his cattle had followed her voice, and as the house filled with morning sounds, wood popping in the stove, a kettle steaming, he realized how long it had been since another presence warmed these rooms, how silence had ruled his life since his wife's passing, thick as dust. And now here was a woman who had crossed his land like fate itself,